What about King David? In debates about whether Christians should be rich or not, that's a very common argument I hear. What about King David? King David was a man after God's own heart, according to 1 Samuel 13. He clearly loved the Lord and served the Lord and feared the Lord, and yet he was very, very rich. In fact, we have a lot of people in the Old Testament that feared the Lord and were very rich. David's son Solomon was even richer than David. There are several other kings, for example Hezekiah, that were very rich. We got Abraham, we got Job, and so on. And many people think that this implies that since these people could love God and still be rich, so can Christians. However, the problem is that the only person who we know lived fully according to the will of God is Jesus Christ, since he was sinless. Even though other persons in the Bible try to live according to the will of God, they fail. And so it's hard to just look at how people live and thereby trying to find what's according to the will of God. If we take Abraham, for example, he was rich, even though he wasn't rich in the Western way today. He mainly had a lot of cattle and cows. But still, Scripture says he was rich. It also says that he married his sister, Sarah. Should we then, by taking the example of Abraham, marry our sisters? No. Because God condemns such a behavior in other parts of Scripture. Likewise, David, the man who lived according to the heart of God, and Solomon as well, they had a lot of wives. They lived in polygamy. In fact, Solomon had hundreds of wives. Should we then live in polygamy as well? No. And we shouldn't be rich, because Scriptures condemns both living in polygamy and having large amounts of personal wealth. And interestingly enough, when we take the example of Old Testament kings, the same Scripture that condemns polygamy of Old Testament kings also condemns personal wealth. Let's check that out. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. Unfortunately enough, it's not a widely known Bible verse, but it's really, really interesting. Here God is prophesying about the future king of Israel, and he gives guidelines and instruction about how this king should live. So he says there in verse 17, "The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray, and he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold." So here it is very clear that God doesn't want the king to live in polygamy, and he doesn't want the king to be rich. So when David and Solomon and Hezekiah and so on accumulated large amounts of silver and gold, they were sinning. Even when they have received their money from God, their purpose was not that they would accumulate silver and gold for themselves. And this is confusing a lot of people. If we take 2 Chronicles chapter 32, it says about Hezekiah, a king who is described as very righteous and God-fearing. And there it says from verse 27, "Hezekiah had very great riches and honor, and he made treasuries for his silver and gold and for his precious stones, spices, shields, and all kinds of valuables. He also made buildings to store the harvest of grains, new wine, and oil. He made stalls for various kinds of cattle and pens for the flocks. He built villages and acquired great numbers of flocks and herds, for God had given him very great riches." And this is a common argument for that Christians should be rich as well, since God gives such a huge amount of money to this guy who feared him. Then of course it should not be a problem for Christians today to accumulate this amount of wealth as well. But as we have seen, God has already condemned kings who accumulate large amounts of silver and gold for themselves. So here it seems that we have a bit of contrast or contradicting Bible passages. However, I'm convinced that we must realize that just because God gives you something, He doesn't defend everything you do with it. You know, if we think that when you automatically, or if you receive something from the Lord, a gift, you automatically is doing good things with it just because you received it from Him. We step into quite dangerous theology. We all have received our bodies from God, yet we can do quite horrible things with our bodies. And no, I'm convinced that God can give money to people. I have no problem with that. But I'm convinced that the goal and purpose when God gives you money is to promote equality and to help the poor. When Hezekiah received this amount of wealth but spent it on silver and gold, he's clearly contradicting Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 17. As a king, he should instead use the money to invest in the well-being of his people. And I also believe to some extent he did. You know, in verse 29 it says he built villages. And of course it's hard to imagine that he built villages just for his personal wealth. If he did, that would be really spooky. But the thing is, when we discuss kings, they are per definition ruling a country, and they are taking care of more people than themselves. They are taking care of a whole nation, and they also have a large household. We can see this, for example, in 1 Kings 4, when we read about Solomon. There it says from verse 22, Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cors of fine flour and 60 cors of meal, 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. This was the daily provisions of Solomon, and I doubt that he ate all of that himself. Perhaps he had some other people to look after. And the same thing is valid when it comes to, for example, Job. Scripture says that he was rich, then he suddenly turned poor and had quite a horrible time, in fact, but then he was rich again. And so many people point to him and say, well, if Job could be rich and God gave him the money, of course we can be rich as well. But we have to look at what did Job actually do with this money. Did he spend a lot of money on himself, or did he give them to the poor? If we look at Job chapter 31, and from verse 16 and onwards, we see that the latter is true. There it says, Job says, if I have denied the desires of the poor, or let the eyes of the widow grow weary, if I had kept my bread to myself, not sharing it with the fatherless, but from my youth I reared him as would a father, and from my birth I guided the widow. If I have seen anyone perishing from lack of clothing, or a needy man without a garment, and his heart did not bless me for warming him with the fleece from my sheep, if I have raised my hand against the fatherless, knowing that I had influence in court, then let my arm fall from the shoulder, let it be broken off at the joint. For I dreaded destruction from God, and for fear of his splendor I could not do such things. So Job here is implying that he is working with poverty reduction. It says the same thing in chapter 29 and several other passages as well, that he is passionate about helping the poor. In verse 29 it says from verse 11, whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist him. So Job is using his money to help the poor, and of course that's a very good thing to do. That's what we ought to do. As I've said in previous part of this YouTube series, Scripture is very clear that when we have a lot of money, we should use it to promote equality and to help the poor. We should not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold for ourselves, but we should give them away to the poor. And that's also what's evident in the Old Testament. There were people that were very rich and accumulated a large amount of silver and gold for themselves, but when they did that, they were actually acting against the will of God. So using rich people in the Old Testament is not a valid argument to say that Christians should spend a lot of money on themselves. And so that was what Scripture says concerning the wealth of the Old Testament people. In the next part of this series, I will look at another common argument for the Christians should be rich, which is when a woman is pouring perfume over Jesus' head, and Jesus, when the disciple says that this money should be given to the poor, Jesus actually defends this woman, and so many are using this as an argument that we could sometimes, spend money on luxury without caring for the poor. However, I don't think that is what this scripture is teaching us. So check that video out. God bless you.